Do you want to, I need an audience vote here. Do you want to start with science or with God? If you want to start with science, put up your hands now. God? This was not pre-planned either. And may I just, again, in the interest of time, ask all of you to quickly introduce yourself when you speak, rather than going through a round. There has been more than one reference to God. There has been a reference to the biosphere, to creation. There's been a reference to the Pope. May I add to that the reference to the American gospel of prosperity that a lot of the charismatic churches now promote, and how that has an impact on climate change and the circular economy and resource efficiency, etc. So, as a theologian, as someone who has an audience in tens of millions of people, how do you take what the experts and the elite and the scientific consensus is saying and translate that into not just the minds, but the heart of the common man to get them to act?
Well, my name is Heinrich Bedford-Strohm, and I represent the 22 million Protestant Christians in Germany, which means not only Lutherans, but also United and Reformed Christians, in case you know some about the different Protestant traditions. You might recognize those expressions. But you are right. It is for me a big responsibility to listen to what we have heard today, and then be very much aware of the importance of those many million people that I represent to react to what you have just said. You spoke about the Pope. I'm, of course, as a Protestant Christian, very, very happy that the Pope has said what he has said about the environmental questions, about ecology, and the World Council of Churches, which represents the Orthodox and Protestant churches in the world, has already in 1990 had a big global assembly on peace, justice, and integrity of creation, where all those contents that we talk about have been in the center of attention. So we have a long history of speaking and reflecting about these things. The prosperity gospel, we should not spend too much time to talk about that, because for me it's a heresy. It does not have anything to do with the gospel. It's an ideology that it's a fraud to the people, because it promises people to become rich when you become a member or a Christian, and that does not have anything to do with the gospel. So let me say why I think that the churches do have a big relevance, especially in terms of the last question, the elite question. If you want to achieve change, you need three things. You need a message that not only reaches your head, but also your heart. And then you need people, and then you need good ideas, good technologies to really enact what you think is necessary. So the first thing, obviously, when you talk about God as the creator, and that's the most basic thing, then you must be aware of the fact that not only yourself, but also non-human nature is created by God. And if you take this relationship to God seriously as a human being, your relationship to non-human nature changes, because you know that non-human nature is co-creation. It's created together with you. So you are not only in relationship to God, but you're also in relationship to non-human creation, and you understand that non-human creation has a dignity too, because it is created by God, just as you. So I think that's the very basics. I restrain myself to speak more about theology, which I would love to do, but we don't have time. But this is the very basics. If you take that seriously, you must be open about to these questions that we have talked about today. And that is also the fact with many people that I see. We have synods, we have big meetings where we speak about how we can take that seriously. We put solar panels on our parish hall rooftops. We set ourselves goals in terms of CO2 emission levels. So there are many activities where we try to take seriously what we speak about. The second thing is people. Obviously, the church is a community, and other religious communities as well. The church is a community that has two very important features for this question. It is rooted all over the world in local communities. And at the same time, it has a universal horizon, because God is the God of the whole world, not just of Bavaria or Germany or Europe or whatever else, of the whole world. So you have a local basis, but this universal horizon. And when I come to Rwanda, for example, where I have many friends, they give me a person who accompanies me. We go into the villages, and in each village, in a hut, the church council is waiting for me. And in one day, I learn more about the problems of the people in the villages in Rwanda than if I read 10 books, except the book that he wrote. I probably learn more about it then. But so this international network is a great resource. So the church is one of the ideal agents of a global civil society, which is exactly what we need for these questions. So we think it's a big responsibility, and we try to respond to it. For example, I've been the, how do you call it, umbrella person of the International Pilgrimage for the Climate Summit. People from all over the world walked, and the last parts, many more from Europe, walked to Paris and collected signatures. So Paris would be a success. So we, the Archbishop of Cape Town, many other bishops, and I myself was there too in Paris when we handed these signatures over to Cristina Figueres, the boss of the chief of the secretariat, and it was a moving ceremony. She had tears in her eyes because civil society was in the boat. And then she started dancing with the Archbishop of Cape Town, and we were all starting dancing. So it's fun, as the young student said. I like it. It is fun to be a part of this big movement. People. And the third and last thing is technologies, ideas. That is why I'm so happy to be here today, because it was wonderful to see what you have just reported, to see that this vision is not just a naive vision of some people, but it makes a lot of sense, and it's important, it's decisive for the future. So I learn from conferences like this, and I can be an ambassador beyond the world. Last point as an example. We have many partner churches. So I went to visit the partner church in Rwanda, the Lutheran Church of Rwanda, 6 million people. And the presiding bishop there leads me through the country, and he shows me the fields, the burned fields, dry fields. And he says these were development projects that you also financed, and we financed together. Now they are dead because of the weather extremities, what we have seen here. And so he shows it to me. And when I go back to Germany, a little later I had to give a lecture at the German Bankers Association in Berlin, invited by the CEO of the German bank then, Jürgen Fitschen, on growth. And I told this story. And I said, when I was in Rwanda, this was Tanzania now, when I was in Tanzania, I preached there. And I started my sermon by saying, dear brothers and sisters. I call them brothers and sisters. How can I forget what their life is like? How they are the victims of our lifestyle. How can I forget that when I go back to Germany? So, and then I told them the per capita CO2 emission of the United States, 16.3 tons per capita per year. Germany, a little less than 10 tons per capita per year. And Tanzania has 0.1 tons per capita per year. And you don't know to say much more. And you don't have to say much more, because every person who is in some way good-willed understands that this is not fair and that this has to change. So there are lots of opportunities, and now I stop.
When we were talking before, I checked that it wasn't sacrilegious for me to stop him because it's not Sunday. May I add a couple of perspectives? Borrowing heavily from HSBC's advertising campaign, Think Global, Act Local, And the universal doctrine and the very local rooted nature of the church reminded me of that. But that is exactly what we've been discussing about the big ideas, the scientific discoveries, the policies, but the need for local action for that to be embedded. And the second, to pat on the back of, for the Protestant church. When I quit investment banking, I spent a few years working with the Jubilee movement for debt cancellation. And I can report firsthand what an important role the church, including the German churches, played in that movement, which wiped away $50 billion from the debt of the poorest countries, which is what led me to spend a couple of years working for Christian Aid, which is the Protestant development arm of the British church. But thank you so much for your efforts. So from one local sort of embedding in the local community to another kind, we've been discussing international summits, we've been discussing national goals, and occasionally we've been discussing individual actions in corporates, by businesses, etc. But so far, we haven't discussed local governments, which is where the most innovative action, perhaps some of the biggest public procurement, some of the biggest public policies that directly affect the lives of people actually happen. So may you please speak to that. And do you have a mic, or should I? Oh, this one.
Thank you. My name is Daniela Hohenwallner. I'm working for AlpS, which is a small company between research and consulting, which is owned by the University of Innsbruck. And my work is to work with municipalities, to touch their hearts. We never dance. But to bring really down these policy things down to earth. We are now starting 2 or 3 projects in the province of Vorarlberg, Tyrol and Salzburg, where we really go into municipalities to talk about climate change adaptation mostly. And this is what starts now really parallel in all regions in Austria. I think time has come. Actually, the municipalities were always working on mitigation issues, and now adaptation is also increasingly important. And this is what AlpS is actually doing. We are translating scientific outcomes into day-to-day practice issues.
On the question of scientific outcomes, there is perhaps nobody better to speak to the latest in climate science and how we can retrospectively look at predictions from 10 years back and think whether we were over cautious or perhaps we underestimated the risks. And please, what is the latest in climate science? Should we be even more worried than all the previous speakers have left us? And how much time do we have? Do we even have the next decade?
I served in the British government with 4 prime ministers, starting with Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, through David Cameron, and more recently Theresa May. And the reason I managed to serve with them was because on climate change we have all-party agreement in Britain. I was also instrumental in driving for the shift in the United Nations positioning on the objective from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. We pushed that through, I pushed it through the British government, and we supported that in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. So let me just explain why the shift from 2 degrees to 1.5. What I can't explain is why some of my colleagues are still living with the 2-degree target, because actually in Paris we said 1.5. We said it must be much less than 2. So first of all, let's just take a look at what is happening around the planet at the moment. If we just look at the impacts of climate change today, there's not one piece of land that has not already been impacted on by climate change. And how severely? Well, actually, 2003 in Central Europe, heat stress produced around 50,000 fatalities. 2003. The Central European summer temperature, if we stay on the present trajectory, is going to be on average the same as that extreme hot summer in 2003. So now let me stress, It's not the average impact that we need to worry about. It's the extreme events that we need to worry about sitting on a larger challenge. And in the British Isles, if you want to know why we have taken climate change so seriously, why I had 165 climate attachés working with me around the world in our embassies full-time, and why we had a budget, a British budget of International Climate Fund with £9 billion in it. Why did we do all that? Because rising sea levels are the biggest risk to island nations. And we know that our island is going to suffer terribly. And the biggest challenge today, the biggest bad news, if you like, comes from the North Pole region, where we know now that over the last 20 years, and a colleague of mine, a very good friend, Peter Wadhams, who's the person who's been patiently measuring this using submarines under the North Pole, we have lost ice volume down to something like 5% of what it was 20 years ago. And what that means is the coverage in ice is now a small fraction of the total Arctic Sea in the summer. Now, why is that a worry? The Arctic Sea absorbs the sunlight much more effectively than the ice, and the Arctic region is now warming up at 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet. And what it's caused already, around the North Pole, there is an Arctic vortex, a wind that keeps the cold air in the Arctic region. And if you're wondering why the recent few months have been very strange in the Northern Hemisphere, it's because that Arctic vortex is now severely distorted. I was talking recently in Dallas, in Texas, where, as I was speaking, and they had never experienced anything like this before, the temperature was minus 15 degrees centigrade in Dallas, Texas. And at that time, I was able to stand up and say, today at the North Pole, the temperature is above 0 degrees centigrade. So this is a massive distortion produced by the warming that has already happened. Now, why should we be worried about that? Well, the big reason is not because it's giving us this very strange weather. The big reason is more to do with the fact that Greenland is now surrounded by warming seas, and if all the ice on Greenland melts, then the sea level globally average will rise by 7 meters. Right? And this is the point at which we say goodbye to London, but goodbye to many, many other parts of the world. Big risks have been analyzed when I was in the British government working with China and India. Those two governments cooperated extremely well with us, and we brought in actuaries from the reinsurance industry. Now, the actuaries are worried about low percentage events, low risk, high impact events. And so when we talked to those countries, we talked about heat stress, we talked about crop failure, and we talked about storms at sea, storms inland, causing rising sea levels to increase further inland, and what the impacts would be. And if we look at the impact of this, where would it be greatest soonest? Is going to be around the Ganges River Delta. Calcutta, the first big city that will no longer be livable in because of the frequency of flooding, and that's not far from now. And just over the border from India, Bangladesh, the first major country that becomes unlivable due to rising sea levels. You're talking about not 1 million people seeking to live somewhere else. You're talking about 110 million people seeking alternative accommodation. Needless to say, after we had finished our analysis, the Indian government took it into their security services and their Department for Defense because they're very concerned about 100 million potential migrants coming into India. And I would imagine there's going to be a great wall resulting from that, just as we've heard earlier on about the wall that Europe is currently building to keep the Syrian refugees and others out of Europe. The destabilization that we could foresee through that risk analysis, arising, for example, from crop failure. Now, crop failure can happen with a rice crop if after planting and the plant is emerging and just as it's flowering, if the temperature exceeds 30 degrees centigrade for 3 days, no crop is produced. What is the likelihood, therefore, of all of the Chinese crops failing in one year? As the temperature continues to rise, an extreme hot summer is going to destroy the rice crops of India. And all around them in Indonesia and in Vietnam, where the major rice paddy fields of the world are, you're going to see the same thing. China's got deep pockets. They'll be on the global market chasing whatever wheat, rice, etc. they can get. I'm quite sure I know what the response will be. The global markets will shut themselves down, and the price of all of these food commodities will go through the roof. All I'm saying is the challenge is far, far greater than you've heard so far today. I don't believe we have to hit net zero emissions by 2070 to 2080. I wish to hell it were the case. 2040, if we can hit net zero emissions by 2040, we have a good chance, by which I mean just better than 50%, of managing the future for human survival. Right? So I'm just saying, actually the latest scientific information, particularly coming from the two poles, I haven't talked about the slippage of enormous ice off the Antarctic, and as soon as that goes into the ocean, sea levels will rise. The risks are enormous. What we need to do is not only defossilize the global economy, let's leave the remaining coal, oil, and gas underground. Let's find these renewable energies and get them across the world as quickly as possible. But more than that, we're going to have to do climate repair. A group of us are now talking about refreezing the Arctic. Is that possible for humans to refreeze the Arctic? I'm going to say to you, actually, we've got to do this. So we are taking this very seriously. We also need to create new carbon sinks. And yes, we need reforestation on a massive scale, and Systemic is heavily involved in that in Indonesia and Malaysia. But we also need to create new carbon sinks using 70% of the coverage of the Earth, which is the oceans. And the deep ocean provides a real opportunity. We need to examine it carefully. If we regreen the deep ocean, recreate it from being a desert, which it is today, not much living matter under there, if we can regreen it at low cost, we can create a massive fish stock, and we can reduce carbon dioxide levels from the atmosphere and put oxygen back in the ocean. There are many decent outcomes from an activity like this. So what I'm saying is there's a new activity on the agenda, which is repairing the climate, because we've already taken it too far.
Maximilian. Do you mind speaking to the point? So we've heard a lot of stuff this morning, and we've just heard Sir David King. How much of this is well known in the general public? How much of this is already being reflected in school curricula? What are the 8-year-olds, the 14-year-olds, the high school, the young graduates learning today? Do they know the state of the world? And if not, what can be done to get them the message so they can see the urgency and the importance of action?
Yes, so my name is Maximilian Riede. I'm a colleague of Daniela. I also work at AlpS as a researcher and consultant. According to your distinction, we're somewhat between God and science. We do research and consulting on climate change adaptation. And concerning your question, I think there's not something like the public or the public opinion. I think there's some really interesting research being done in Yale, but also in Germany on the different perceptions and the different attitudes towards climate change in the public. So there are 6 Americas, there are 5 Germanys, different ideas and different knowledge, different attitudes among the public. And when you talk about young people, especially teenagers, they're really interested in this topic, and we see that there's an increasing interest among teachers to material in this field. There's an increasing interest among young people to really get in contact with these issues. And I think our challenge is to really take this seriously and not understand, although it's really urgent and the next 10 years matter, but to really, in our free and liberal society, to really understand education from an emancipatory perspective and not from an instrumental, because we don't want to steer young people towards this eco-totalitarianism, but we want them to be critical, to kind of reflect on their lifestyles, because they have to change their lifestyles themselves, and they have to agree and see the bigger picture. So this is really difficult to, on the one hand, accelerate this change, but on the other hand, do it in a certain and emancipatory way. And I think in the end, it wouldn't be enough to kind of wait for the top-down decision until the curricula will have changed and we all know what to do, because we see in our practical work that it's in the end the teachers themselves, and they have, if they want to and if they're really interested in it, they have a huge window of opportunity, and there are many options that they can do. And I think it's 6 years ago that Professor Stötter, who is here at the University of Innsbruck, started an initiative in a very rural area in southern Germany, and now hundreds of students keep coming back to a nearby glacier here. And so what they do, they really see the impacts of climate change themselves with their own eyes. But as we know, it's not just a matter of information that you understand greenhouse gases and the impact on glaciers. We also start conversations with them about values. So religious education plays a tremendous role in this discussion. So it's about knowledge on the one hand, so the brain, and the heart on the other hand. And I think, it's a big challenge for educators, but there's no time to wait for the top-down legislative and follow top-down regulations.
I'll quickly do one quick last round, and then we will try and wrap up. So you are not kept too far away from your discussion of theology with wine, which I think I've heard from makes a good combination. So David, isn't part of the problem that in our daily experience and the way our education and sort of human intuition works, it's all about linearity, right? If something went from 1 to 2, it's going to go from 2 to 3. And what we are missing in our intuition and in our education, in our public understanding and even policymaker understanding, is the peculiarity of the non-linearities within climate change. For example, there have been recently reports of the weakening of the Gulf Stream. I mean, I think most people can't really envisage how that will impact us. I mean, Texas is at the same latitude, I think, as Oslo. But how do we get that across, the irreversibility and the non-linearity, to the general public and the policymakers against their intuition? It's almost like explaining quantum physics to those who are sort of classically trained.
I think one of the factors here is that the rate of change is becoming more and more apparent each year. So if we just look at insurance payouts over the last year, these insurance payouts all represent news that we've seen in the media. Fires in California, fires in Australia, fires in Portugal, fires in Spain, all of these forests burning down. What's the commonality there? It's the change in rainfall patterns. These are forests that are drying out. And so as soon as there's a tinder around, a spark, off goes the fire, and there's a large loss of housing, and hence the insurance losses. It's the same with extreme weather events. Now, you mention a very important factor, which is the so-called Gulf Stream. And I say so-called because scientists prefer to talk about it as the thermohaline current. And this is important because what is happening there needs a scientific explanation. So when ice melts up in the Arctic or the Antarctic and enters the ocean, the ice itself has no salt. So if that happens rapidly and this salt-free water enters the ocean, the level of salinity of the ocean is rapidly changed. Now this thermohaline current is the current that carries the hot water from the tropics up into the north, and then the cold water circles underneath it. That rise and fall of this current is determined by that level of salinity. So what we see is there's not only an explanation, it's something the scientists predicted would happen. The British government funded an effort to measure the change in the current flow right across from Europe to the United States. And so it's these careful measurements that are producing what we're now observing. I think really it's going to be the severity of the impacts that really wakes up the world to the rapid change that is happening, and therefore the focus that we all need to bring collectively onto actions to reverse this problem. And that's why I'm now using the phrase reverse, not just to slow down, but to reverse. We really have to repair the global climate system.
In one quick sentence, so we heard a couple of references to the Himalayas and the Gangetic Plain, and we know the billion-plus people who depend on that and live there. How relevant is the work you're doing in the alpine community here and the lessons you're learning here to the ecosystem in other similar mountain catchment areas which are facing similar problems of glacier melting and flooding?
Yeah, I think it's highly relevant. I think the AlpS play a big role. They are a role model for maybe solutions, and this is also what AlpS is working on, to create solutions for the impacts of climate change, but also to work on this transition or transforming society. Yeah? When you say, okay, we need to explain or to make visible the changes, just a short example, when you're going in a municipality, you tell them in Tyrol, the mean annual temperature is 2.9 degrees Celsius. In Burgenland, it's 11 degrees Celsius. Just imagine this could be the case here. Yeah? Then you can imagine what the environment could look like. I think if you work with these simple pictures, then you can really reach the persons. Simple means not to be trivial. I think you need to be correct concerning science, but you need really to translate all this knowledge we have created now in science.
Understood. One last word to God.
Maybe I may just mention one theme that we simply have not really touched yet, but I think that is crucial, and that is economic justice. We have spoken about this theme and about the ecological impacts, but I think it's crucial that we understand that we will only resolve this problem if we also speak about economic justice. The poor people in other parts of the world, they say, our first problem is that we have something to eat. And we have had many discussions in the churches, and by now I think we as churches, we all know together that those two questions can never be separated from each other. And in Germany, the people who lose their jobs when the coal is gone, we need to have solutions for them too. We need to speak about how those who are affected by the changes will not be the victims again. If we can offer solutions, if we can create a trust that this great transformation that we need will not be to the cost of those who are vulnerable anyway, then there is a chance that it will work. And maybe a last sentence by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, who has once said, if the last day is coming, we are happy to lay off our work for a better future, but not before. I think that we can say that whether we are religious or not.
With that, we thank our panel. Thank you so much. So I will not even begin to try and sum up, but as you followed the conversation, we've touched God and country and science and humanity and justice and everything else in between. And I hope you go back inspired and happy. And may I, to say the final words, call Jeremy Oppenheim, the co-founder of System IQ, with Martin to close the conference. And just as Jeremy is walking here, given that everybody here is either friends of Martin's or colleagues of Martin or fans of Martin or yet to be any of those, may we sing him a happy 50th birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Martin. Happy birthday to you.
Right, I'm going to do the absolutely impossible, which is to try and offer some closing to what has been just an astonishing afternoon. And I'm also going to keep it really short, you'll be glad to know, because I know that I stand between you and something outside. So here's what I took away. First thing is that we have actually 3 incredible gifts in our hand, and they're all available to us. One gift that we have is that, as Nick pointed out, in 2015 and 2016, we set a framework for where the world should be heading. And that was the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, and both are important because we need to have the economic justice, we leave no one behind, along with the environmental agenda. You have to put the two together. We also have an extraordinary change in the profile and the trajectory of technology, which deployed properly is a huge part of the answer. It's not all of it, and it never will be. But it's coming through in a way that we never thought was possible. The idea that Adair was consistently wrong, right, is really good news for us all. And the third thing that we have is what Dave just shared with us at the end, which is actually we don't have much time. Right? We're way behind where we should be. And if I know one thing, it's that we only take action at the very last moment. Right? We don't take action when we've got 50 years to run. Right? If we thought it was 2070, right, we wouldn't actually get our act together because we're pretty useless in that respect. At least I am. Right? But when I'm up against a deadline, and when we're up against something that really is an imperative to get done quickly, it is remarkable what we can achieve. So I don't take the 2070 to 2040 debate as a problem. I take it as the best thing possible. So we have actually got a set of goals, we have technology coming through, and we have urgency. And these are all, if we play them properly, absolutely on our side. We have a big problem, and let's not kid ourselves. The core of the problem is the challenge around political action and the coordination of coherent political and social action. And it's not that we're short of the capital. We've got trillions of dollars sitting in negative earning accounts. It's not that we're short of the technology, but we don't have the coherent political leadership. And that needs to be underpinned by social support from multiple sources. And one thing I'd say, and we'd never really talk about this thing called SDG 17, which is about partnerships. And certainly for those of us who work in systemic, one of our core propositions is that we need to make this a very big tent. We don't win on what is an absolutely critical agenda, and an agenda which can be filled with creativity and joy and innovation. We don't win unless we bring a whole range of players on board. We need to bring the religious community on board together with the non-religious community. We need to bring the major corporates together with the startups. We need to bring we need to bring the developed world and the developing world. And we need to find ways to make this something that is the basis not just of a technical set of acts, but a rediscovery of what it means to be people together on one planet. And that's a huge, huge challenge in communication terms, but it's an incredible opportunity. I mean, I'm not going to make the case that if we didn't have climate change, we'd need to invent it. But there is an argument that things that really bring us together and the great challenges are the things that actually allow humanity to be at its best. And I hope that that is what is going to play out, and everything that we do as systemic, everything I know Martin does, is with that in mind. What are the three things that we can do, right? There are 1,000 things, right? So I'm going to inappropriately summarize them in three, because I can't actually do more than three. So one is, we heard loud and clear, go after the big stuff. Right? And it sounds trivial, but it's actually quite important. There's an incredible amount of energy we can spend on the small stuff, but getting after the big stuff, and the big stuff includes oceans, right? It also includes China, it includes coal. There are half a dozen really big things, right? It's that urban infrastructure over the next 15 years, right? There aren't 1,000 of them. There are half a dozen really big things, all of which we need to get after with a vengeance and do them seriously. And certainly for us, again, in systemic, we will spend our time on the half a dozen big things. Second, it came up a number of times. It came up less often than I thought. But we just need a big fat carbon price, right? Unambiguously, right? It's not the only externality for which we need to price. It's difficult. We all know that it's difficult, but it's not as difficult as we make it out to be. The world that has a $100 carbon price solves a tremendous number of the issues that we've been wrestling with, because it triggers across the economy, right, an incredible number of decentralized actions that actually point us in the right direction. So I think here in Europe, Nick said it, others said it, we should be fighting a very strong case for a very strong carbon price, and then figuring out how we link up with the real innovation centers across the world, which are probably the Californias and the Chinas and other places, but making that central. Last thing, and most importantly, much, much more important than any of the things I've said so far, is that I have come to realize the central significance of chocolate in this entire story, right? And actually more than chocolate, melted chocolate, right? Because it's that combination of fire and extremely good chocolate that gets people to sit together, right? Not only to actually talk and figure out the answers to things, because it's when we sit around the fire, right, metaphorically now, I guess, but with good chocolate in our hand, that we come up with the ideas and we come up with the ability to work together that makes all the difference. But apparently, it's phenomenally good brain food, right? And that is going to be at the heart of our solution. It's bringing people together, applying their intellect to solve common problems. And I can think of no better way to do that than around a fire with some extremely good chocolate in hand. So, with that, I think I'm going to hand over to Martin, or just completely close. No more handovers. So, thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. It's been a quite extraordinary afternoon. And we invite everyone to join us for drinks following the conference. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, the university. And thank you all.